That tells me
Yeah.
I'm not nuts.
Thank you.
Well, they have.
Okay, I gotta check on the sound here.
No, it's not planning to move out. No, well, that's the problem. They were looking for a place to stay. Or they were doing a mold business, and I don't know if they found
No.
something. So you're gonna pick that stuff up tomorrow? It's coming tomorrow. Help me on roll. Cotton, so put it into the library and I work on it slowly.
All right, nobody's on, otherwise I'd ask them if they could hear me, but hopefully that's good.
So maybe you have to put them in the back. I don't want to shut.
That should be good.
You're telling me?
Should be good. Oh.
That's true. Okay, I was gonna say, if we have any women here today, because the fashion show was,
Probably not my type of fashion.
Yeah, as we get underway, I'll just share with you that there was a young lady, I remember growing up in a community that was very friendly with at least one of my sons. We thought there was a potential shidduch there. It didn't work out eventually. But when she got older, she went into clothing design, and she has her own design of tznius clothes. Own design. You know, you can order her stuff online, and she's really done very well.
Nowadays, she's still around.
Oh, yeah, she's married, has her own family.
In New York?
No, she lives in the Midwest.
Oh, really?
You know the website? No.
Ask Karen. She might.
In Chicago or what?
Probably. Okay, we're going to start with our bracha. Everybody, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshenu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, if we finish our topic today, this will be the last shiur. If not, we'll have one more next week to finish. I want to do two things basically today. I want to focus on Rabbeinu Tam, okay, and what his impact was as the grandson of Rashi, and really what I'll call the heir, H-E-I-R, in terms of Talmudic analysis. We'll use that word, okay? And he wasn't the only one. Sorry, he wasn't the only one, but he is I will call him the paramount individual.
Oh, that's fun.
Sforno is biblical, not Talmudic, okay? And we'll talk about him. And then I also want to give two examples where Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam had arguments. Okay, imagine your grandchildren coming up to you and saying, hey, no, you don't know, but that's not right, kind of thing. All right, after you
I
figure.
don't have to imagine.
Oh, okay.
As long as it's in the right, okay.
All right, so why should we focus on Rabbeinu Tam, okay, in this situation? After all, Rabbeinu Tam was really following the model of his father, okay? Rabbeinu Tam's real name was Rabbi Yaakov ben Meir. So his father was Rabbi Meir ben Shmuel. Okay, he was married to Yocheved, who was one of Rashi's daughters. Okay, he was one of four sons, the youngest of sons in that family, and he never knew in person his grandfather.
Wow.
He was born after Rashi was nifter. Okay? But does that mean he would not know of his grandfather and what his grandfather taught? Absolutely, he was very well familiar with Rashi. Okay, his commentary on the Chumash, because remember his oldest brother, Rabbeinu Tam's oldest brother, was Rashbam. So he would have studied both with his father and his older brother, and therefore would be familiar both with the, well, call it the biblical material, as well as the Talmudic material. That, okay? So that's why it's important to see him as a bridge also, Rabbeinu Tam. Okay? He supposedly saw his grandfather, and we'll get to this in more detail in a moment, his grandfather's commentary on the Gemara as a running commentary. And therefore, in that case, he saw his place really to comment on his grandfather's comments as much as on the Gemara itself. Okay, so if we think of it, okay, that's why, in a sense, we call Rabbeinu Tam, in other words, I wouldn't say the founder of the Tosafot approach, but certainly the, in Hebrew, they would say the Avtipus, the primary model, example, okay, of what became 2 or 3 or 4 generations of scholars that we now call Tosafot, okay? The additional commentaries. He learned this approach from his father, Rabbi Meir, who began to comment on Rashi's commentary, okay? But it was a specific methodology, okay? The story, whether it was true or not, we don't know, was that the story was already by that time, so we're now a second generation after Rashi, or at least a generation and a half, where each of the students that sat around the table knew almost by heart an entire Masechet, an entire tractate of the Gemara. Okay, and so when the comments would come up, this one would say, oh, in my Masechet, Rashi said X. In my Masechet, says another one around the table, Rashi said Y. About this, either the same section of the Talmud or a slightly similar section. And so therefore you had this, I'll call this multi-log going on between what Rashi said in his commentary, what the students then cited from each of the various locations, and then an attempt to meld it, to understand, to put it together. Okay, so it was this kind of criticism, if you will, or analysis that we might call it. Okay, so they did not see themselves as writing a new commentary on the Talmud, but rather a kind of focused reconsideration, okay, with a more analytical approach. Thank you. Okay, you should call me Abed Bala. Okay, with this kind of analytical approach to the text, okay, to emphasize one point or another. So they treated Rashi's commentary as if it was, you want to call it the basic text on top of the Gemara, okay? And then would continue. So that's why their approach is called Tosafot, a kind of additions. Okay? They often would refer to Rashi as Ha-Parshandata, the commentator.
Why did they call it Tosafot and not Be'urim? Because they wanted to explain what Rashi says. isn't it?
Because they,
Not to
because they
add.
didn't see themselves as explaining him,
So what-
because at times they challenged him and they gave alternatives. Okay? And so that is part of the reason that they saw themselves as adding to and clarifying what he was saying. Okay? It's as if, somebody were to take notes of a class, all right? And after you went through your notes, you then put notes to your notes.
But Rashi didn't give notes, he explained.
But still, that was the point. They saw themselves as adding to his explanations, even where they might challenge, okay? Right? And so that was going to, as if they were going to bring clarity or consistency to his explanation of the various chazal, of the various rabbis. Now, why are we, again, connecting with this? Okay. With the death of Rashi, okay, and his father, Rabbeinu Tam's father, was already advanced, also pretty much in age. Who was going to take over the leadership of the yeshiva in Troy? Okay, it had to be somebody who, number one, financially could do so. Okay, in other words, give that time to study. Number two, who had the knowledge and the respect of the community to do so. But again, if we come back to our historical element, what had occurred, what major event did we say occurred towards the very end of Rashi's life? First crusade. First, because Rabbeinu Tam himself, we read a little short piece, was impacted by the second crusade, which was 50 years later. Okay? So the nature of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles changed in France after the first crusade. Okay? We talked about before then the fact that there was a situation where they got along business-wise, socially, etc. That wasn't the case now, two generations later. Okay, in the time of Rabbeinu Tam, it was a different France from when his grandfather lived. There was a persecution already of Jews at the time of the first crusade. There was a weakening of structure of the Jewish community, because we said that what did the first crusade do? It nearly destroyed the communities of Worms and Speyer and Mainz, where the great yeshivas were. So it impacted physically, intellectually on the Jewish community of what we call Ashkenaz. And so nevertheless, the fact that we had these individual scholars like Rabbeinu Tam, and later on, a generation or two later, like Rie of Dampierre, which I'll mention in more detail shortly, okay? That these individuals were nevertheless able to continue Jewish learning, Jewish scholarship. Maybe the yeshivas were smaller. Maybe they didn't have the name that Worms and Speyer and Mainz had, okay, under Rabbeinu Gershom and others, okay? But learning was still going on and still passing it from one generation to another, okay? It's at this point then that the Jews, again, because of the lack of economic advancement, found it difficult. And what happened? as Jews began to leave France and northern Germany. Where did they go? They went to England, believe it or not,
Not Poland.
Not Italy.
then Central Europe, and ultimately Eastern Europe.
But didn't he go to Hungary?
Hungary was considered Central Europe, right? So that's the point. So the fact that Rabbeinu Tam then nevertheless, so to speak, stood up and take a leadership role, okay, was important. Because he then would continue Rashi's work spiritually, intellectually, okay? Now, Rabbeinu Tam, interestingly enough, continued in a number of business ventures, okay? He apparently was fairly well-to-do, okay? Besides the business with, I guess we would call viticulture, besides the business with sheep and things like that. Okay, one of the main occupations that Jews then wound up being in was business and finance, loans. Okay, what did the nobles need the loans for? They were going to get ready to go on another crusade. And so they needed money to, right, go travel. And I don't mean just for vacations, right? Okay, to buy armor, to buy horses, to pay for ships, all of these things. So who would loan, could they go to? People like Rabbeinu Tam, wealthy Jews, okay, that they would interact with the nobility, would interact. So one of the other texts that I found suggested that one of the ways that Rabbeinu Tam was able to be involved in the loan business was that because Jews continued to travel for commerce, okay, there was a diamond exchange. And so he became a diamond broker as well, okay? So basically he began to have a lot of contact with the non-Jewish nobility. And in that regard, he would be able to act as a spokesperson for the Jewish community. Okay? And if you remember what that small piece we read when they, during the Second Crusade, we read about they attacked his home and they brought him out in the field and they were going to, okay? And a nobleman came along and said, oh, I'll take care of him, okay? In other words, don't kill him because I won't have a source of money. Yes.
Couldn't the nobility just seize the Jews' money?
Ultimately,
Huh?
they may decide to do that. But right now they needed them. Okay? So Rabbeinu Tam then, both because of his, let's say, economic status and relations to the Gentile community, and because of his learning, became the head of what existed at that point as the main Jewish community there in France, in northern France as well. Okay. Okay, and as one in the writer put it, his wealth, personality, and contacts made him a power in the Jewish world of France, while his scholarship, Torah knowledge, and halachic prowess made him the community's unquestioned leader. Okay? One of the things that therefore we need to keep in mind was that given this situation, okay, and the chaos that happened in a sense to the Jewish community, he needed to step forward and clarify certain halachic practices. Okay? He was the Gadol Hador, in essence, at that point. And therefore, as the main halachic decisor, okay, he would issue certain statements and practices. So I wanted to share at least a little bit today, two key examples of that all of us can identify. Okay, if you have a mezuzah, how do you hang it on the doorway of your house? Slanted. Why?
Compromise.
It's a compromise. Okay, so I was doing a little research.
Why is that important? Which way? The main thing is that.
Listen, and I'll tell you. Listen. Okay, by the way, that compromise only works in Ashkenazic community. What? Okay. Mezuzah is placed on a slanted midway between vertical and horizontal. The top of the mezuzah tipped counterclockwise when facing the mezuzah, so that the mezuzah points to the room being entered when the mezuzah is on the right. According to Rashi, the mezuzah should be placed vertically. According to Rabbeinu Tam, horizontally.
What's the reason?
Most Sephardic communities follow Rabbi Yosef Karo and fix it like Rashi. In Ashkenazic communities, they accepted a compromise. Why? Here's the answer. It's based on a piece in the Gemara where they use the Hebrew word nagar. Sorry. Nagar here, okay, is no, that's a noun of what a carpenter is. They're talking about part of a door, and they're talking about a bolt or a latch that is attached to the door. That's what the word basically means in the Gemara. Okay, Rashi understood it to mean a side bolt. Okay, in other words, think of you slide it across, right, to lock your door. All right.
Is this an Aramaic word?
In Aramaic, right?
Nagar is an Aramaic?
Okay, so it would be affixed horizontally, right? Now I'm saying may not be fixed horizontally if it's a side bolt, or is it affixed vertically, right? So Rashi's argument, okay, a mezuzah may not be fixed horizontally, but rather should be, in other words, it wasn't rolled up, it was laid out in a niche in the stone of the door frame. Okay. Some Sephardim, in accordance with this opinion, do not roll the mezuzah parchment, but affix it flat on the doorpost.
It makes sense, so you can read it.
Right? By the way,
What about weather? What
no,
if the
you put a
weather-
cover.
Why do you got water?
By the way, Samaritans actually have it all written out in stone above their doorways. If you ever get to visit Israel, Shomron, that area, you can actually see it.
Makes sense.
The whole Shema and V'ahavta, all carved into the stone, right above the lintel. Okay? Rabbeinu Tam disagrees with Rashi. He understood Nagar as a vertical bolt. Okay? Because maybe by his time, they didn't close the doors. They won't be able to see, but I don't think there's anybody there. Okay, they didn't have cross, they had up, right, vertical, up and down. Okay, according to him, because a mezuzah affixed vertically resembles a hinge, it would be invalid. He therefore writes to affix the mezuzah vertically would be disrespectful, right? Like burying a person vertically. Right? Rather, a mezuzah should be placed horizontally, just as the tablets were placed horizontally on the Holy Ark. Okay? What happened? Shulchan Aruch and Gra rule according to Rashi, while the Ramah sides with Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, what happens? Ramah reports, says the position of the Tur and the Maharil, okay, with other examples. So what happened? Okay, what did the Ashkenazi community do? They put it neither like Rashi nor like Rabbeinu Tam, but as a compromise on a diagonal, right? If the opinion of Rashi was to affix the mezuzah vertically, and that of Rabbeinu Tam was to do so horizontally, placing the mezuzah at a slant, neither vertical nor horizontal, seems to be contradictory to both opinions, right? The opinion of Rashi was that the mezuzah fixed horizontally is invalid. Opinion of Rabbeinu Tam would be invalid. Okay, and what happens? Therefore, they came up with an example. It's neither like this one nor like that one, but we'll compromise and put it. So that's one example. Okay, the other that we might be familiar with, okay, is basically tefillin. Okay, we have two kinds of tefillin, right? Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi. Are they really different? Not really. What? Not to women? I don't know. I don't know. Rashi's daughters, remember?
That's right.
They're not here now.
Right, right? Okay, so what is the issue with tefillin? Okay? All right, so let's think of tefillin the following. Head tefillin. Right? Shel Rosh has 4 compartments, right? 4 separate compartments, which of course reminds us that there are 4 sections in the Torah in which the reference to tefillin. Okay, now what is the order that those sections of the Torah should be put in to those compartments? Should they follow in the same order that those sections of the Torah appear in the Torah?
Makes sense.
It would seem to make sense. So you would wear Rashi tefillin then, if you chose to put it on,
Makes sense.
right? But what did Rabbeinu Tam say?
Why does he have to always?
No, he says he takes it different. Rashi assumes that the tefillin sequence follows the parshiot in the Torah. Okay, right to left, from the vantage point of the person looking at the tefillin wearer. Okay, Rabbeinu Tam disagreed. And he said just a different view. First 2 are in order. The other 2 are a separate unit. And therefore, they have to follow their own order. Okay, so you've got Kadesh, Vayakev V'yecha, Shema, and V'yahavta. Right? Right? Vayayim Shemoah, Shema V'yahavta, and Vayayim Shemoah. Right? So he argues that basically the progression begins with Kadesh and Vayakev V'yecha. That's 1 unit, and then it continues with V'hayayim Shemoah, and then the Shema. So he argues that it doesn't follow the way it appears in the Torah. Okay? Now that's the basic, in other words, they don't disagree, one second. They don't disagree on what parshiot we use. It's basically the order that they are to appear inside that film. Yeah.
Couldn't you just look how the tefillin was set up, let's say 2 generations earlier, 3 generations earlier, and that's the way you do it. That's the Masorah. How did you come up with a different set of tefillin than Rashi?
Okay. Good question. Okay.
Or
Did
just
you?
look at what the Spartans do? You're from a whole different thing. If you do it like Rabbeinu Tam, then that's how it should be done. If they do it like Rashi, then that's the way it should be done. Because they're a totally separate group, and if they agree with one or the other, then you can assume that they've got it from their Masorah also, so that means that's the way to run it. Or do they do it differently?
Let me answer you with the following idea. Again, do we see them as a single unit? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, or do we see them as two separate units?
But it also has to do with how it's written, because it has to be written in order. So that means that the Sofer at the time of Rabbi, if we just went to the Sofer, say, in what order do you write? If you write it this way, that's how it
But
goes.
wait. You're right. But remember, I'm talking about two sets, two places where tefillin are. On the arm tefillin, we might say, I might agree with you. After all, right, all of it is written on a single parchment. But if I'm talking about the head tefillin, where each one is an individual piece, I might argue, no, this one goes in this compartment and this one goes in a different compartment. Okay,
So that means when the Sofer tells me that because something is missing on parchment number 3, and I have to replace them all. So he's taking me for a ride. Because
No. It may be that if he discovers that there's a problem with compartment number 3, that there could be problems with other compartments as well. That's why you have him check the tefillin, I think if I remember, twice in 7 years, right? Yeah.
But when Rashi came up with the order of the parchment, was he doing something new or was he just continuing the Masorah?
He was continuing what he was following that he saw from his teachers.
Okay, so then what Rashi was doing wasn't just Rashi, it was what had been done up until then. And what did inspire him to do just out of curiosity?
I'm not sure. I
Makes sense.
okay. I assume that there could be Sephardim that also put on more than one pair of tefillin. Okay? But what I wanted us to see at this point is that this, of course, does have, a number of considerations, right? According to that, again, being whether it's one whole unit or 2 units of 2.
What is the predominant practice today? Who do we follow?
I would suggest, I would say that in most Ashkenazic that I'm familiar with communities, they would use simply Rashi tefillin. Okay,
Yeah, the
But
only
there
ones that I
are-
know of that put on 2 pair of children are Hasidim.
right, but there are groups that put on 2, which raises another interesting
But
question.
the Shayad doesn't change.
Okay, but raises a slightly different question. And then we'll come back to talking about Rabbeinu Tam a little bit more. Okay, elsewhere in the Gemara, okay, of course, it's long before Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, the question of location of head tefillin comes up. Okay, and there happens to be a story in one place, I don't remember the exact location, where it talks about one of Chazal wearing 2 tefillin of Rosh,
Right.
2 head tefillin. Okay, why 2? Because therefore there must have been some sort of Masorah, okay, that said that there was a basis of some question. And I'm suggesting that it very may well be that Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi's, that this disagreement may well reflect a much earlier time, okay, during Chazal and the Talmud, when not all of the details, parameters, halachas, if even we want to say that, were clearly spelled out in terms of tefillin. We know, for example, that they used to wear tefillin all day in the time of Chazal. Okay, except if they needed to use the restroom, of course. All right, or maybe even when they went to sleep, or one or two other kinds of situations, okay? But clearly, it makes sense if we understand that that could have been a situation that Rabbeinu Tam would say, well, if there are examples in the Gemara where somebody wears two tefillin of Rosh, okay, it must mean that there is a difference between the structure. And that could be why he ruled in that way. Okay, the last piece here, okay, just to share with you, it cites later authorities like the Rosh and others. If Rabbeinu Tam established a new pattern for tefillin, presumably this would apply equally to tefillin shel yad. Alternatively, the Rabbeinu, okay, may be maintaining the Torah sequence, but positioning the parshiot in the housing of the tefillin shel Rosh in a manner that allows right to left Torah sequenced reading from different angles. In other words, if we're talking about it, the following. Are we talking about it from the person, the onlooker, to the person? Or are we talking about it from the wearer and what direction we're talking about? That could be part of the sequence as well. So all of this then are just, as I said, I chose those two cases to indicate that Rabbeinu Tam did not necessarily feel that he was totally bound by his grandfather's halachic decisions. Okay, and we see that, as I say, down even to today. Okay, now, again, as we begin to finish up a little bit, the economic situation, the spiritual situation, okay, we had to deal also, he had to deal with another question, which Rashi had to touch on somewhat, but certainly by the time of Rabbeinu Tam and afterwards became even more significant. Part of the purpose of the Crusades, again, history, was convert the Jews. So what did you do with Jews who had been forcibly converted and now wanted to come back? Okay, we said that some of them were leaving France. Where did they go? To England, to Central Europe, perhaps even other places. Now they want to rejoin the Jewish community. Yes, they had been converted under forced circumstances. But what do? How do you decide? What process is necessary? Okay. By the way, that can even be a question sometimes, even in today's society. You have people who are, let's say, raised in a certain situation. Okay, and I know I had it in my own pulpit experience, where someone came and there was a potential marriage. And the young lady, the fellow was Jewish, the young lady was not. And as we explored and talked about her background, she says, I remember that my grandmother used to do X, Y, and Z. Like Friday night, she would go down to the basement and light candles. Most Catholics don't do that. Okay. And she gave us a couple of other examples. So the first question that came to mind is, your grandmother used to do that? Oh, yeah. I remember her doing that.
So what's the halacha?
Okay. So do you consider her Jewish or not?
If it was grandmother's and mother's mother.
Exactly. In this particular case that I'm sharing with you, it was her mother's mother. Okay?
Yeah, but the mother
But as Ada just raised, as I'm to put it in a question, but her mother
Did not.
did not. Her mother didn't observe anything Jewish.
So that's the Korea.
So that's the question. So do you require her to go through the, so to speak, normal process of conversion? Or do you, what has to be done? So those kinds of situations really still even come up in the contemporary rabbinate.
So
but
what's the
just-
halacha today?
You deal with each case individually,
Well, but here is a case, the mother was not Jewish.
okay?
So what do you,
What did we do?
like today, if the case like.
In that particular case, I'll tell you what we did. Okay?
Yeah.
Because of Suffolk, we did have her go to the mikveh,
Yeah,
okay? And we did require her to do a certain amount of Jewish education,
that's it.
okay?
No, I
I
mean.
mean, I have had other experiences where, in other similar situations. So that's the issue. Do you do it, are you going to be machmir in a situation like that?
Well, didn't the rabbi make an halacha?
I was the rabbi, and I was the one who had to
Okay,
decide.
but the rabbinical council, let's say, there is a top.
No, no.
No date.
What?
No date.
Of course she had a base.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying.
Okay, of course, we
There's a
wouldn't,
make an
right?
halacha.
So we had her educated, we had her at the mikveh, and after the mikveh, she met with a beis din. Of course, but the question is, did we really need to have to do all that? That's part of the whole discussion.
Yeah.
So coming back now, why do I bring that up? Because that's the kind of thing that Rabbeinu Tam had to deal with in that time period. He was aware of the difficult financial situation, the difficult spiritual situation. He had other questions to deal with besides conversion, issues of monetary law, interest, for example, okay, that the Jewish community was, in a sense, almost held ransom, in a sense, by some of the nobles, and what happened there. Okay? And so all of these were practical issues that he also had to deal with. Okay? So from Rabbeinu Tam, okay, we began to see then that there needed to be this role, okay, which he stepped up to as the spiritual leader of the community. But it was also the fact that he established this structure of learning. In fact, he has a sefer, a book of halacha called Sefer Hayashar, Rabbeinu Tam, okay, that has been passed on. Unfortunately, today we don't have much copies of it. But besides halacha, Rabbeinu Tam also wrote tefillah. He also wrote prayers. He also wrote poetry. So, and again, that element of Ashkenazic Jewry that we think about now in terms of, we've referred to the Machzor Vitri before, who was a student of Rashi, okay, Shmuel Vitri. But what eventually happened is they continued in terms of those directions. Okay, the yeshiva that Rabbeinu Tam was in Ramrut, where his father had been, and eventually, because of the Second Crusade, he had to leave that city, and many of his students then went to England and France, left France, for England and other parts, all right? And by the time Rabbeinu Tam died in 1171, the Jewish community of France had begun to dissipate, fall apart, okay? And it was only the individual efforts of individual scholars that to continue that Tosafot tradition, okay? And I'm going to finish up now with the one example, who I would say, after Rabbeinu Tam, became perhaps one of the next most important individuals of Tosafot. His name was Rabbi Isaac ben Samuel of Dampierre. He is known as the Ri, R-I, Ri Dampierre, or Ri the Elder, and he was the basically the nephew of Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, so in a sense, we begin to continue to see that it was the progeny and the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a family line of Rashi that really began to maintain Jewish scholarship. When after Rabbi Tam left Rambrut, Rabbi Isaac lived in Dampierre, okay? And when Rabbeinu Tam died, the Ri became the leader of what was left of Franco-German Jewry, okay? Why is he important? Why should we mention it? Besides his being, as I said, one of the major Tosafists, okay? He is also important because his material is cited in a number of other places. They saw him as an authority. So later on, for example, in Yam Shel Shlomo, which is written by Rabbi Solomon Luria, he cites the Ri on Tractate Chulin in terms of certain kashrut laws. So that's one example. Another was the fact that he wrote a significant amount of teshuvas, responsa. Okay? And so here too, again, right, his piety and his education made him a model for the community. Okay? Afterwards, other commentaries look to him, okay? And a number of the other later scholars all based their texts on his material. One example was Rabbi Baruch ben Isaac, who wrote a book called Hilchot Haget, laws of divorce, okay? And again, all of it based on decisions and writing of Ri Dampierre, okay? So what I wanted us to understand as we sort of come to a bit of a closure today is that it was the heritage, the influence of Rashi and his family that really helped shape Ashkenazic Jewry, both in terms of the Talmud and in terms of biblical studies, biblical literature, interpretation, and ultimately in aspects of prayer as well. And so the same way that when we started, that we said that the Sephardic community could point to Maimonides as the leading authority and personality who helped shape, okay, but he did so not only halachically, but philosophically. Okay? So Rashi then should be considered the significant personality of Ashkenazic Jewry that helped shape that worldview and enabled Jewish scholarship to be passed down for generations. So when we look at the Rashi and his times, we can see the interaction between the history and the man and his contribution to both. Thank you all.
How about the Sephardim? Do they study the Talmud the way we do? They don't have a different Talmud.
They don't have a different
They have a
Talmud,
different shikha.
but the approach is somewhat different. Just to answer Ada's question real quick, okay? Generally, Ashkenazim tend to follow what I'll call an iyun approach, which means you go in depth, right? So you would study Rashi, the Gemara, Rashi, Tosafot, everybody else on the page, okay, and then other Rishonim, okay, and so on. Sephardim tend to perhaps what I'll call a more Bekius approach. Okay, in other words, one is more vertical, one is more horizontal. Right? Bekius being, okay, familiarity across the board. Okay,
They study more in depth, or what?
not necessarily in depth,
So what?
okay, but a much broader, want to say a broader curriculum, a broader spectrum, okay, of material.
But they still study the same function, the same.
It's same Meforshim,
So what-
it's, I guess I would, I would compare it, and it's an inappropriate comparison. If I wanted to be familiar with Shakespeare, okay, I would read Shakespeare, and then I might read other English literateurs who followed after him. Okay? If, on the other hand, what I could do is if I said I wanted to be familiar with Shakespeare, I might read not only Shakespeare, but I might then try to read any French literature of the same time,
So do they
any
read the-
German literature of the same time.
So do they read other sources than the Talmud, or?
Sure. Okay, that's why I said it's more it's more horizontal. It's more across, right? But it's the same text,
Well,
but it's a
yeah.
different approach in terms of learning.
Thank you.
Are Rashi and Tosfot always a continuation of the writings in the Gemara?
I would have to say no. And let me just quickly explain why I say that. A Braita, by definition, is a Tanaitic text. Okay, a text of a statement of Tanaim that is not in the Mishnah. Okay, it was not included by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi when he edited the Mishnah. Okay, it was, those were statements that are existent in another book that was written, edited by somebody else, and that book is the Tosefta. Okay, and so what happens is if I cite something, okay, or the Gemara brings you Rabbi not Yehuda Rebbe's Mishnah, when they bring a Braita, they're bringing a parallel statement, but something that Rebbe did not include. And so the question might be, how come the language in this statement doesn't go along with this statement? Okay? Or how come this contradicts this? Or how come it seems that the same person who cited here in the Mishnah said something else in a Braita, and therefore how can you have the same sage contradict himself? And that on one foot is the Gemara. Okay.
Okay,
All
thank
right,
you.
Ivan.
You know, in Ashkenazic yeshivas,
Yeah.
you know, the Talmud is emphasized with Rashi and then others. In Sephardic yeshivas, what is the emphasis? Does it differ?
I would have to say, never having attended a Sephardic yeshiva, I can only suggest that there is probably more emphasis, added emphasis on Sephardic authorities and Sephardic halacha. Okay? I'll just give a quick example. The Baba Sali, does anybody ever hear of that
Yeah,
name?
yeah.
Okay, who was the Baba Sali?
They
The
believe it.
Sephardic sage in Israel was just, and he died recently.
Right. So he was from Iraq, I believe, if I remember. Okay, but you have other major Sephardic poskim and authorities also. But as Ashkenazim, we're not necessarily familiar with them. Okay, we look at the Rosh, we look at the Rif. The Rif was more Sephardic, but remember Rabbi Yosef Karo, right? What was he basing his, right? He wrote a book, okay, a commentary on the Torah. The Torah was the son of the Rosh. Okay, so what happens? He writes this commentary. He realizes that not everybody is going to sit and read his commentary. So he writes a digest of that commentary. What does he call it? Shulchan Aruch. All right, so that's fine according to most Sephardic practice. But along comes Rabbi Moshe Isserles, and he was going to write a whole halachic book. And he says, I don't have to do that now. I just have to make appropriate comments for the Ashkenazic community on the Shulchan Aruch. And what does he call it? The mapah, the tablecloth. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Very much. Thank you.
So when's the next session?
We're done for today.
For next year?
Yeah, that-
I have to start thinking about what I'll teach next. I have a couple of ideas. I may run it by a few people to see what.
Yes, thank you very, very,
Okay.
very much. Rabbi Greene, thank you very, very much for a very, very enjoyable workshop.
Thank you.
Well prepared, thank you. Yeah, sure. Shabbat.
Vakasha.
Have to go shopping. She's at the fashion show. She won't go through too much.
All right.
Oh, it's filling. The thing is that the word totafot,
Yeah.
it's a whole shiloh about
Oh,
where
that's
that
a-
word even came from.
Not just that, the Gemara, I don't know. If when we get to, there's a whole discussion as what does the word totafot mean? Does it mean tot? No, is it tot, tet? Is it two sets? Okay, which like we talked about, it's two separate sets. Okay, two and two. Okay, or not. So I really think Rabbeinu Tam based it on the Gemara. To think that it was two separate sets. And that's why he decided his view of how to sequence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.